Hey, well, joining us live is Shadow Home Affairs Minister, Senator James Paterson. Senator, thank you very much for joining us. So what are your thoughts on this? Because it also talks about it stops short of committing to a number.
Well, it's worth it, not even what the paper it was printed on. The Prime Minister has the opportunity to commit more on defence spending in the budget every year, and in every budget the Labor Party has held since the last election, he's failed to do so. In fact, he's cut ADF capability, including infantry fighting vehicles, howitzers and joint strike fighters, just at the time that we can't afford to be making cuts to the ADF. So he needs to put his money where his mouth is and actually promise real increases to defence spending to match the strategic environment we find ourselves in. The Prime Minister himself has admitted that this is the most dangerous time since World War II, but he doesn't have the action or the follow-through to match that rhetoric.
The article also talks about the Trump administration asking its allied nations to spend more than 3% of their GDP on defence, and that's amid concerns of Russia advancing to expand its influence on the region. What can you tell us about that?
Well, the coalition is committed to increasing defence spending to 2.5% of GDP within 5 years and to 3% of GDP within 10 years. But we're doing that for our own reasons, in our own national interest, and we're following the advice of people like Sir Angus Houston, a former chief of the Defence Force who conducted the Defence Strategic Review for the Albanese government and recommended a 3% spend, just like the former Labor leader and Defence Minister Kim Beazley has recommended. The only way you're going to get that spending, though, is under a coalition government. You can't trust Labor to actually deliver it.
Senator, we're just getting some new information in the Daily Telegraph not long ago. It talks about opposition leader Peter Dutton's Dixon electorate office vandalised for the second time in just 8 days. It talks about the vandals this time smashing the glass front door. What can you tell us and what needs to be done here? Because, again, we're just hearing more and more of this.
Unfortunately, this is an increasingly frequent occurrence, and not just targeting Peter's office, although his has been targeted a number of times, but targeting members of parliament all around the country with graffiti and even more serious acts of violence. We saw one electorate office belonging to a Labor member firebombed in my home city of Melbourne. This is out of control and it's totally unacceptable. Australia is a country that has had political violence-free elections for almost all of our history. It's an incredibly rare event, and we want to keep it that way, because if we have more acts of violence like this, it will change our political system fundamentally and forever in a way that I think we'll all regret. It's critical that the people who are responsible for this are identified, prosecuted and held to account to the fullest extent possible under the law.
Protests at yesterday's Anzac Day service in Melbourne are not likely to meet the criminal threshold under the Victorian anti-vilification laws. Do we need to change the laws?
Well, it was absolutely disgraceful conduct from someone to boo in the middle of an Anzac Day ceremony. In my view, Anzac Day is Australia's most sacred day. And if you come to an Anzac Day ceremony, you should be respectful of the proceedings. And the idea that it's appropriate, whatever your opinion on other issues, to boo, I think is disgraceful. Frankly, some of those people involved self-describe themselves as neo-Nazis. And the truth is, they would have been on the wrong side of World War II had they been around at the time. So they are the people who we last need to take advice from on patriotism or on the law.
And the NRL cancelled the Welcome to Country at the Melbourne Storm and South Sydney Rabbitohs match last night. The Storm later came back with a statement saying that there was miscommunication for the cancellation. Is that excuse, if you want to call it, miscommunication, is that good enough?
Look, it's really up to event organisers whether they want to have a welcome to country at their events. I think there are times when it is appropriate and is welcome, and other times where you may not want to do it. It's really up to the NRL and the Storm to answer for why in this instance they chose not to have one, but I certainly have no problem with it happening in an appropriate way.
All right, and Prime Minister Anthony Albanese spoke a couple of hours ago saying that Australians will be better off with their government and certainly worse off with the coalition, and they would be $7,200 worse off, in fact, talking about cost of living. Do you agree with that number?
That's just a made-up number that the Prime Minister is using to try to scare people. It's not based on anything substantive or truthful. It's a baseless claim. It's another lie that the Prime Minister has told in this campaign, of many lies. In fact, our count as of a few days ago is he told 76 lies in just over 20 days in this campaign so far, which is an absolutely extraordinary number. The truth is Australians know they've gone backwards on this Prime Minister's watch, despite the fact he promised 3 years ago they would be better off under Labor. So why would you think that the next 3 years under a re-elected Albanese government would be any better. I think you can have grocery prices, electricity prices, gas prices, rent and everything else go up in the next term, just as they have in this term, if this Prime Minister gets back in office.
He also spoke about insurance, Senator, on climate change as well. The Prime Minister mentioned that climate change is economic and environmentally an issue. He also mentioned that Peter Dutton is oblivious to this. Peter Dutton has come out and said that he does believe in climate change, but do you think he's oblivious to the fact that it's an economic and environmental issue?
Well, it was interesting when the Prime Minister was asked that question. He had no proposal, no ideas, no policies at all to deal with the fact that insurance costs are up 35% over the last 3 years on his watch. And there are a number of things that have contributed to that. But one of the things that has contributed to that is the increase in crime on his watch. Now, particularly in my home state of Victoria, there's been record levels of crime committed over the last 12 months. And the flow-on costs of that are not just for the victims, who are obviously very distressingly become victims of crime, but every person who pays insurance pays the cost of that, because insurance companies have to pay out more people for their claims when they have their car stolen or their home invaded. So this Prime Minister's weakness on community safety, coupled with the weakness of state Labor governments like we have in my home state of Victoria, has cost all Australians significantly, and it will cost them even more if he gets back.
He also said, finally, Senator, that he is pro-aspiration. What would you say to those comments?
Well, I wish that was true, but on the Prime Minister's watch, aspiration has taken a massive hit. In fact, living standards of Australians are down 8% over the last 3 years. That's the worst in the developed world and the worst in Australia's history. Australians are finding it even more difficult just to make ends meet, let alone aspire to more, and particularly the aspiration of home ownership has disappeared on his watch, and young people have lost hope that they'll ever be able to buy their own home. That's why the Coalition has a comprehensive plan to restore the dream of home ownership and restore the dream of aspiration in this country, because every Australian should aspire to be better off than previous generations and for their kids to be better off than they are. But on this government's watch, they fear that that won't happen.
Shadow Home Affairs Minister Senator James Paterson, thank you so much.